I'm Kathy Brasby. I'd like to welcome you to a new study. We'll be looking at Jesus in the book of Luke in the New Testament, specifically Luke 15. I studied this in depth a few years ago, and it really had a deep impact on my life and how I looked at other people. And I hope that it has an impact on you as well. Let's dive in. This lesson will largely be an introduction to the chapter because I think it's always important to look at things in context. I want to caution you not to look at these parables with your 21st century Western eyes. We have to go back into that first century to understand what Jesus was meaning in these parables. For example, the very first parable deals with sheep, a very agricultural, rural kind of setting that many of us are not familiar with today. So we will have to unpack some of these things and look at it through the first century. Allow me to introduce you to a wonderful resource in this class. His name is Kenneth Bailey. He was an American son of missionary parents who spent most of their adult lives in Egypt, Sudan, Ethiopia. So he had a chance to learn and absorb those Middle Eastern cultures as a boy. He went to the Pittsburgh Theological Seminary as a young man, and then he and his wife chose to return to the Middle East. He went to Egypt in 1955, and he had a chance to absorb folk culture, proverbs, sayings, even much of the language. He got to know many of those Middle Eastern people, and he would sit down and ask them questions about even parables and say, what does this mean to you? And they would say, oh, in our culture, we would look at this way. Quite different than what we're used to in the West. After retirement, he wrote 10 books with distinctive biblical themes. They're valuable resources for us today as we study New Testament, especially the time of Jesus. Unfortunately, he died in 2015 at age 85, but I want to encourage you to look him up. One of our resources for this class is his book, The Cross and the Prodigal, Luke 15 through the eyes of Middle Eastern peasants. Here is a quote from Kenneth Bailey. It is the basic presupposition of this study that the insights gained from looking at the parable of the prodigal son through the eyes of conservative Middle Eastern peasant society, ancient and modern, are a better starting point than the cultures of North America or Europe. This is taken from his book, The Cross and the Prodigal. So we will keep that in mind as we go through the book. What would our first century reader or listener would have understood as Jesus told these parables? So what is a parable? Basically, it is a story, it is a picture for us with words. Words about the human experience. It is not an allegory. Think of, say, the book Pilgrim's Progress or even Moby Dick. Those are allegories. They had direct symbols to particular principles or ideas. A parable is a call to a better life and a deeper trust in God. That's really what Jesus was aiming at. It is literary art, and that's something I appreciate so much about the Bible, is it is incredibly well-written literature. It is artistic. What else would we expect from the Creator God but incredibly creative, artistic literature? We can appreciate that side of it too. And then it also has incredible themes for us about the nature of God and what Jesus came to teach us. In the book of Luke, back in chapter 9, Jesus has begun his journey to Jerusalem, that final journey toward the cross. And it continues through Luke 15 and on beyond that in the book. Luke 15 is kind of the peak of the crisis, the conflict between the Pharisees and Jesus. They had continued to nitpick at him, finding fault. And he continues to answer them. And at this point in 15, their grumbling has gotten to the place. He answers them in parables that spoke to them very directly. Let's slide back into Luke 14 for a minute, help us get a running start into our chapter. There are a lot of eating and food in chapter 14. Let me give you some examples of that. In Luke 14, Jesus has healed on the Sabbath while he's eating with Pharisees. That was a great offense to them, and they were insulted by his healing on the Sabbath. But notice he was eating with them. He taught about humility, about taking the lowest place at the table while he was eating with the wealthy. Again, we see food and eating together. At another banquet, he tells the host, encourages the host, to invite the poor, the crippled, the blind, rather than the influential. This was at a feast, at a banquet. We have a parable of a great feast focused on those who were invited but not coming. Another banquet. And then Jesus concluded the chapter teaching about discipleship. So we see this context of food and banquets and sitting down together. This is very valuable for us as we look at Luke 15. You have probably heard these parables in Luke 15, but perhaps not as one connected unit. They're often taught separately, and themes are taken out of them based on their individual standing. But I would submit that we need to look at them together as a group to really understand what Jesus was getting at. The very end of Luke 14 tells us that there was a large crowd following Jesus. Remember, he is on his way to Jerusalem, and so were many of them. They were going there to celebrate the feast of Passover. But they were attracted to Jesus and his teachings and his sermons and what he was doing. We have that surroundings, large crowds. Let's read Luke 15, 1 and 2 to set the stage for this study. Now the tax collectors and sinners were all gathering around to hear Jesus. But the Pharisees and the teachers of the law muttered, "This man welcomes sinners and eats with them." We continue this theme of eating together. The problem, as we begin this chapter, Luke 15, is that as Jesus was teaching, tax collectors and sinners were coming near to listen to him. They weren't honoring the Pharisees. They were coming to Jesus instead. Sinners, Luke generally means people of low moral character. These sinners would be in contrast with the Pharisees. The Pharisees prided themselves on knowing and keeping the law, and not only just the law of Moses, but all the explanations they had come up with to help you keep the law better. They took great pride in being law-abiding Jewish citizens. Also, we have these tax collectors. Some would refer to them almost as a tax farmer. They paid for the right to collect taxes. The Roman government would allow them to collect whatever they chose to collect. The Romans asked for a certain amount. Above that, you could collect whatever you chose. So you can imagine what this would do among the Jewish population of that first century. First, these fellow Jews are collecting taxes for the hated Romans. Second, these Jewish tax collectors now had the opportunity to encourage bribes, graft, exchange, favoritism. They could become incredibly wealthy, and yet at the same time they were detested by their fellow Jews. Luke refers to sinners as people of low moral character, also possibly unclean, probably breakers of the law. They could perhaps be traitors to their fellow Jews, traitors perhaps to God. They would be unclean. This includes a lot of people. They would be the lowly, the lowlifes, the rejected, and in some cases detested people. But we see Jesus welcoming these people. He didn't buy their favor. He didn't compromise, so they didn't feel bad about themselves. And yet sinners were drawn to him. He spoke truth and he spoke life. And notice that these sinners were coming to him. They took the initiative. They were drawn. They wanted to hear him. They weren't looking to get healed. They weren't looking to get rich. They just wanted to hear him. Notice that they were listening, and notice what words were being spoken. These were Jesus' words that they want to hear. Now, I also want you to notice in this same passage other words. These were words from the Pharisees and the scribes. These words were words of grumbling. They had two choices, Jesus or the law keepers, and they chose Jesus. Let's look a little further at this word complain. It's the same word that was used to describe the Israelites centuries before when they were in the wilderness coming out of Egypt. And they grumbled because things were not like they were in Egypt. At one point they said they wanted to go back because they missed all the wonderful things of Egypt. They forgot the slavery, the hard work, and they were grumbling. Sometimes we call them murmurings. And they were murmuring against Moses and against Aaron in the wilderness. There's just this undercurrent of discontented complaining. And we see it repeated here in Luke. The audience to whom Jesus spoke consisted of the Pharisees and the scribes, whom the people would consider the righteous of the community. We also have Jesus speaking, and we have these irreligious or unrighteous or sinners. We have three groups. These Pharisees, Jesus, sinners. These three groupings will appear throughout each parable that we look at. All three of these parties, which would be the found, the lost, and Jesus, we can call them different things, but we will have three distinct parties that will appear in the parables. Also, this is just background, but in these parables coming up, we will see a progression. The first parable is about a lost sheep. Second parable is about a lost coin. The third parable is about people. So we go from animals to a lifeless coin, these two, but then Jesus' message culminates with humans. And we have one or possibly two parables, depending how you split them. So we see the Pharisees, the scribes, murmuring or complaining because Jesus is welcoming sinners and eating with them. Let's look now at this word welcomes. There's the idea of welcoming into fellowship. By eating with a person, those Middle Eastern people in the first century were accepting that person on a basic, fundamental level. Not terribly different today when we invite somebody to join us for dinner or we go out for lunch. That idea of welcoming into fellowship. We don't do that generally with people that we find abhorrent. In that first century, if the guest was some kind of a teacher, religious leader, the people who would invite him would believe that this guest would give them a blessing. So we see Jesus, by welcoming these people, is accepting them, and there's also the hint that he may give them a blessing as well. These are the people that are being ostracized by the righteous, the Pharisees, the scribes. It wasn't unusual for Jews to offer meals to the poor. That was almost a religious requirement for them, but it was unheard of for them to sit down and eat with these sinners. They could put the food out there, but to eat with them carried the idea of acceptance and welcoming, and they certainly didn't want the poor to get that idea. For Jesus to host sinners would be a much more serious offense than just to feed them. The Pharisees would not have objected had he provided food for the poor. But to host them, to invite them into his presence, to sit with them and share food together, that was offensive. The issue that we're dealing with on a surface level is that Jesus is eating with sinners and is welcoming them and accepting them and perhaps providing a blessing to them. But this issue goes deeper, as you can imagine. It is crucially important to Jesus, and and also to his opponents, the Pharisees and the scribes in this case. Tax collectors and sinners, as described here in Luke, were infinitely insignificant. They had no importance. And so here we have Jesus, who is a great teacher, a rabbi who has a great crowd following him, is now interacting with people of no significance. Tax collectors and sinners were considered lost. There was no mechanism in Jewish teachings to bring them to significance. They were unclean, they were lowly, and Jesus' table fellowship with them was offensive to the Pharisees, the scribes, other Jews. So what we will see with the coming parables is Jesus' defense of what he's doing. In the next lesson, we will be looking at the parable of the lost sheep. To a Pharisee, a man of a despised class, like these tax collectors and sinners, was not even as valuable as a sheep. In contrast, Jesus welcomes sinners, and this was obviously the issue for the Pharisees. It caused their mumbling and grumbling. Jesus welcomes sinners. This was an issue for the Pharisees. Jesus did not buy the favor of these tax collectors or sinners. He didn't join them in ethical compromise. Sinners knew where he stood. He spoke clearly and truthfully to them, but they were nevertheless drawn to him. In our next lesson, we will take a look at the parable of the lost sheep. The question is, what might today's Christians do that might cause people to ask, why are you doing that? And give us an opportunity to explain. This is what we see in this introduction to our parables. The Pharisees said to Jesus, why are you doing this? And Jesus takes the opportunity to explain to them clearly why he is welcoming sinners and tax collectors, why he is fellowshipping with them, why he is accepting them, why he is speaking plainly to them, and why they are drawn to him. Powerful things that we're looking at in the coming parables. So I hope you'll come back next time as we look at the parable of the lost sheep. I'm really excited about this series of lessons. I think there's just wonderful truths for us as followers of Jesus. So thank you again for being here, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Have a great week. God bless.